Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of those stories that sounds exciting in textbooks, but in real life was mostly a bunch of tired men, bad decisions, and an awkward outdoor meeting that absolutely nobody enjoyed. So go ahead and dim the lights. Get comfortable. Let your brain loosen its grip on today. We're drifting back to medieval England, where democracy was not being born so much as accidentally tripped over, face first, in a damp field. This is the story of the Magna Carta, which sounds grand and noble and extremely intentional. It was none of those things. Now, before we float too far, let's gently meet our main character, a man who somehow managed to be king, unpopular, unlucky, and deeply irritating all at once. A man whose own barons would eventually look at each other and say, you know what, actually, let's try paperwork. That man was King John. And yes, of course it was him. John was the youngest son of King Henry III, which already sets the tone. He was never meant to be king. He was supposed to be that extra child who gets some land, maybe a title, and spends his days bothering his older brothers. Instead, through a series of deaths, rebellions, and extremely bad luck for everyone else, John ended up on the throne in 1199. No one was thrilled. John didn't have the heroic glow of his brother Richard the Lionheart. He didn't have the patience of a saint, the charisma of a leader, or the general vibe of someone you'd want running a kingdom. Chroniclers described him as petty, suspicious, greedy, and emotionally volatile, which is medieval code for this man will absolutely ruin your week. And ruin it he did. John inherited a massive political mess. England wasn't just England. It was tied to large chunks of France, Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, a patchwork empire held together by family ties and vibes. Unfortunately for John, his vibes were bad. Within a few years, he managed to lose most of England's French lands to King Philip II of France, not in a dramatic blaze of glory, more like a slow, humiliating unraveling. Fortresses fell, allies switched sides, nobles quietly stopped returning his letters. John responded the way he always did, by charging more money. Taxes went up, fines increased, justice became something you could buy if John felt like selling it that day. If a baron annoyed him, suddenly there was a mysterious legal violation from 10 years ago that needed immediate payment, coincidentally in cash. This did not improve morale. Now, medieval kings were expected to be strong, but also just, harsh but predictable. John was neither. He was impulsive, he micromanaged, he held grudges like treasured family heirlooms, and he had a special talent for making enemies out of people who were already reluctantly loyal. By the early 1200s, England's nobility was exhausted. Not rebellious yet, just tired. Tired of arbitrary fines, tired of losing land in France, tired of watching their king pick fights with literally everyone, including the church, because of course he did. John got into a long, bitter conflict with Pope Innocent III over who got to appoint the Archbishop of Canterbury. John wanted his guy. The Pope wanted literally anyone else. John refused. The Pope responded by placing England under interdict, which meant churches closed, sacraments stopped, and spiritual dread filled the air. John responded by confiscating church property and acting like this was all very funny. It was not funny. Eventually, the Pope excommunicated him, which in medieval terms was catastrophic. Excommunication wasn't just spiritual, it was political. It was basically the Pope telling everyone, you don't actually have to obey this guy anymore. John eventually caved, publicly humiliated himself, handed England over to the Pope as a vassal state, then paid to get it back. An incredible maneuver, truly. Financially devastating, emotionally embarrassing, perfectly on brand. And then, once again, he needed money. So more taxes, more fines, more pressure. By now, the barons were no longer just tired. They were angry. Quietly at first, then openly. They weren't dreaming of democracy. They weren't thinking about rights for peasants. They just wanted John to stop doing whatever he felt like whenever he felt like it. They wanted limits. This is important to understand. The Magna Carta was not born out of idealism, it was born out of mutual irritation. By 1215, a group of rebel barons had had enough. They organized, they gathered support, they captured London, which is medieval shorthand for, "We are extremely serious now." John panicked. But he didn't panic in a reflective way, he panicked in a, "Fine, I'll agree to anything if it makes you go away" way. And so everyone agreed to meet. In a meadow, near the River Thames, a deeply unromantic place called Runnymede. Picture it. June 1215. Tents, horses, mud. A king who didn't want to be there, barons who didn't trust him, and a document that no one expected to matter in the long run. The Magna Carta, or Great Charter, was essentially a list of demands, written in Latin, very serious, very legal, and extremely specific. It covered inheritance rights, feudal payments, access to courts, and the behavior of royal officials. And tucked inside all that medieval bureaucracy was something quietly revolutionary. The idea that the king was not above the law. Not shouted, not dramatized, just written down. Clause after clause limited John's power. He couldn't raise certain taxes without consent. He couldn't imprison free men without lawful judgment. Justice could not be sold, denied, or delayed, which is a gentle medieval way of saying, "Stop doing that." John agreed, out loud, with his seal. Inside, he was absolutely not agreeing. Within weeks, he was already trying to get the Magna Carta annulled by the Pope. Innocent III happily obliged, declaring it invalid and forced upon the king. Civil war immediately followed, because of course it did. John died the next year, in 1216, probably of dysentery, which feels appropriate. His 9-year-old son, Henry III, inherited the throne, and because regents needed peace, they reissued the Magna Carta. Again and again, slightly edited, slightly softened, slowly becoming tradition. Over time, its most radical ideas stuck, not because John wanted them to, but because no one trusted kings anymore. And that's the quiet magic of the Magna Carta. It wasn't a sudden birth of democracy. It was a grumpy compromise, a legal leash, a written reminder that power could be limited if enough powerful people were annoyed at the same time. It didn't protect everyone. Peasants were still peasants. Women were still excluded. This was not equality. It was containment. But once the idea existed, once it was written down, it never really went away. Later generations would reinterpret it, inflate it, mythologize it, turn it into a symbol far bigger than its original intent. Lawyers would quote it, rebels would reference it, kings would quietly resent it. All because one deeply unpleasant monarch pushed his luck too far. So as we drift forward, just remember, democracy didn't arrive with fireworks. It arrived with a sulking king, a group of angry nobles, and a very serious piece of parchment laid out in a field. And that's exactly the kind of beginning history loves. Now let's gently float onward, because things are only going to get messier from here.
All right, settle back in. Nothing sudden is about to happen. Just a slow continuation of men in robes trying to outmaneuver each other with parchment. When we last drifted off, King John had exited the story the way he lived it, unhelpfully. The Magna Carta had technically been annulled. Civil war was simmering, and England was held together with little more than exhaustion and habit. And now, the throne belonged to a child. Enter Henry III, who became king at the age of 9, which frankly was an improvement. A child king couldn't be more arbitrary than John. He physically lacked the energy. Because Henry was a minor, England was run by regents, sensible, cautious men whose primary goal was to stop the country from tearing itself apart. And one of the easiest ways to do that was to dust off that awkward document from Runnymede and say, gently, reassuringly, "Look, we're doing this again. Calm down." So the Magna Carta was reissued. Not exactly the same version. Some of the sharper barbs were softened, some clauses were trimmed, but the core idea remained. The king's power had boundaries, written ones, and the regent's promised to respect them. This mattered, not dramatically, not immediately, but quietly, like a background hum. As Henry grew up, he became, well, Henry. He was deeply religious, emotionally sensitive, fond of art and architecture, less fond of finances. He spent lavishly, especially on churches, relics, and foreign relatives, which, as you can imagine, went over beautifully with English nobles who remembered very clearly where this kind of spending led. Henry also had a habit of making grand promises and then forgetting about them, or reinterpreting them, or deciding they didn't apply today. The Magna Carta became something he swore to uphold whenever he needed support, and something he ignored whenever he felt secure. Which brings us to an important shift. The Magna Carta was no longer just a peace treaty, it was becoming a reference point. Every time Henry annoyed his barons, which was often, they would point to the charter. Not angrily, almost politely, like someone reminding a roommate about agreed-upon chores. And eventually, they stopped being polite. By the mid-13th century, England entered another long phase of noble frustration. Henry's foreign advisors were unpopular, his financial demands were relentless, his governance was erratic. The barons, once again, gathered together and said, "We've done this before." This time, the conflict produced something new. A reform movement led by Simon de Montfort, a charismatic noble, intensely principled, slightly intense in general. Simon believed the king should rule with the consent of the realm, not just barons, but representatives, which was ambitious. In 1258, Henry was forced to accept the Provisions of Oxford. These limited royal authority and established a council to oversee governance. Think of it as Magna Carta's slightly more organized cousin. And then, inevitably, everything fell apart. Civil war followed. Again, because medieval England loved nothing more than a good, slow, exhausting internal conflict. Simon de Montfort eventually defeated Henry and briefly ruled England in the king's name. And here's where things get quietly interesting. In 1265, Simon summoned a parliament, not just nobles and clergy, but representatives from towns, ordinary landowners, not peasants exactly, but not elite either. It wasn't democracy, not even close, but it was a concept. For the first time, governance included people chosen to speak for others, not just because of blood, but because of location and consent. Simon didn't last long. He was killed later that year, his body mutilated, his movement crushed. Very medieval ending, very unpleasant. We'll keep it vague and sleepy. But the idea survived. Because once again, it was written down, and once again, it was useful. Henry III died in 1272. His son, Edward I, took the throne. Edward was everything Henry wasn't: energetic, decisive, militarily competent, very fond of conquest, especially in Wales and Scotland. Edward was also pragmatic. He understood the value of a curing lawful, of ruling with consent, at least symbolically. He confirmed the Magna Carta multiple times, often in exchange for taxes. A very straightforward transaction. I promise to behave, you give me money. The Magna Carta by now was no longer radical. It was tradition, a thing kings swore to uphold, because not doing so caused problems. And here's where the story slows even further. The Magna Carta didn't suddenly transform England. It didn't free the masses. It didn't create elections. It just stayed. It was cited in court cases, used in disputes,
reissued when convenient, ignored when not, but always remembered. Over the centuries, lawyers began to reinterpret it. Clauses meant for barons were read more broadly. Freemen slowly expanded. The idea of due process hardened into expectation. The king ruling under law became normal. And this is how democracy really grows, not with declarations, but with habits. Fast forward several hundred years, England had changed. Feudalism faded, Parliament gained power, monarchs still tried to overreach, Parliament still pushed back. The Magna Carta was there for all of it, quoted, revered, occasionally misunderstood. By the 17th century, it was treated almost like sacred text. During conflicts between Parliament and the Crown, lawyers waved it around like a legal talisman, proof that English liberty had ancient roots. This mythology mattered. When English colonists crossed the Atlantic, they brought these ideas with them. The belief that rulers were bound by law, that taxation required consent, that justice had rules. The Magna Carta wasn't copied directly, but its spirit was everywhere, in petitions, in charters, in arguments. It influenced the English Bill of Rights, it echoed through colonial grievances, it shaped the language of later constitutions. All from a document no one at Runnymede expected to last. And that's the deeply ironic part. The Magna Carta wasn't designed to empower the many, it was designed to restrain one man, a deeply annoying man, but once restraint became precedent, it could be expanded, interpreted, claimed. Kings hated that, because once people expect limits, unlimited power starts to look rude. So when we call the Magna Carta the birth of democracy, what we really mean is this. It was the moment authority was written down instead of assumed. The moment power stopped being purely personal and started being conditional. Not fair, not equal, just conditional. And that was enough to change everything, slowly, painfully, over centuries. So as we drift onward, keep that in mind. Democracy didn't rise, it accumulated. Clause by clause, argument by argument, one sulking king at a time. And next, we'll let this idea travel even further, across oceans, across rebellions, into places that would take this sleepy medieval document and turn it into something much louder. But for now, breathe. The parchment is still drying.
All right, let's finish this gently. No revolutions jumping out from behind the curtains, just a slow, inevitable spread of an idea that refused to stay quiet. By the time we reach the early modern period, the Magna Carta has become something strange. It's no longer just a medieval contract between a bad king and angry barons. It's a symbol, slightly dusty, frequently misquoted, deeply useful. English kings still didn't love it. They tolerated it, they swore oaths to it, they quietly hoped everyone would forget about it. And then along came the Stuarts. First, James I. James believed very strongly in the divine right of kings, which is the idea that monarchs are chosen by God, answerable only to God, and definitely not answerable to lawyers waving old documents. James found Parliament annoying. Parliament found James alarming. The Magna Carta hovered in the background like an awkward family memory everyone pretended not to bring up. Then came his son, Charles I, who took all of his father's worst instincts and doubled down. Because why not? Charles ruled without Parliament. He raised money through questionable means. He imprisoned critics. He acted like limits were optional suggestions. Parliament responded by doing what Parliament does best when ignored. It got extremely stubborn. In 1628, Parliament presented Charles with the Petition of Right. It directly invoked Magna Carta principles: no taxation without consent, no imprisonment without cause, no martial law in peacetime. Charles agreed, briefly, then ignored it. This ended exactly how you think it did. Civil war. Execution. A king very publicly discovering that limits can, in fact, be enforced. Now, we'll keep this calm and non-graphic, but it's important. Charles I was executed in 1649, not by a mob, by a court, a legal process, one that argued the king had broken the law. That argument only works if the king is subject to law. Thank you, Magna Carta. After a brief and uncomfortable experiment with not having a king at all, England restored the monarchy, carefully, nervously, with conditions. In 1689, following another royal meltdown, Parliament passed the English Bill of Rights. This firmly limited royal power, strengthened Parliament, and enshrined rights like free elections and freedom of speech in Parliament. By now, the idea was unavoidable. Kings ruled under law. Always had, always would. At least on paper. And lawyers loved this, especially one lawyer in the 18th century named William Blackstone. Blackstone wrote massively influential legal commentaries that framed English law as a long, continuous tradition of liberty. He placed the Magna Carta right at the beginning, as the ancestral source of rights. This was, historically speaking, a bit generous, but it was persuasive, and persuasion matters. Across the Atlantic, English colonists were paying very close attention. They saw themselves as inheritors of English rights. When the British government taxed them without representation, colonists didn't say, "We want something new." They said, "You're violating what we already have." They cited Magna Carta principles: due process, consent, law over authority. When things escalated, slowly, irritably, inevitably, those ideas shaped the foundations of a new political system. The result was not medieval, but it was related. The United States built a constitution rooted in the same basic assumption. Power must be limited, authority must be written down, leaders must be constrained by law. The Magna Carta wasn't copied, it didn't need to be. Its job was already done. And from there, the ideas spread outward, through empires, through reforms, through slow legal evolution. Constitutional governments across the world echoed the same concept, sometimes sincerely, sometimes cosmetically, but always recognizably. No one needed a king in a meadow anymore. They needed rules. That's the quiet legacy here. The Magna Carta didn't invent democracy. It didn't imagine equality. It didn't care about universal rights. What it did was far more modest and far more dangerous to absolute power. It introduced the idea that authority could be boxed in. Once that box exists, people start asking who else should be inside it, and that question never really stops. So when we call the Magna Carta the birth of democracy, we're being poetic. What it really was the birth of expectation, the expectation that rulers answer to something, the expectation that law outlives individuals, the expectation that power should justify itself. All because one king pushed too far and a group of elites decided enough was enough and wrote it down. Which is honestly how most progress happens. Not heroically, not cleanly, but through irritation, negotiation, and extremely boring paperwork. So as we gently close this out, let yourself rest in that thought. Democracy wasn't born shouting. It arrived murmuring, in Latin, on parchment, in a field no one wanted to stand in for very long. And somehow, it stuck. All right, that's enough history for tonight. Let the kings fade, let the lawyers sleep, and let the parchment finally rest.